the Scientific Archer. My name is Jake, and today we're going to be looking at the effect of the mass of the arrow on the arrow's downrange velocity. I'm going to be shooting these arrows through a lab radar to collect their data at launch all the way out to 60 yards. I'm going to be shooting arrows that range from 350 grains all the way up until 650 grains, which is the Ashby recommendation. I'm going to be shooting the Matthews Lift 29.5. I have a 27-inch draw length, and I'm going to be shooting at 60 pounds to collect this data. Without further ado, let's get into some shooting. The other day, I was able to shoot all the arrows through my bow to collect their velocities at launch all the way out to 60 yards. Today, we're at my computer to look at the results. So first, I want to take a look at the velocity chart. And as we go through these results, I would highly suggest pausing the video at any time to look at each of these charts more in depth. So when we look at the velocity of each arrow, particularly the velocity at launch, you can see that the lightest arrow comes out of the bow the fastest. This really shouldn't be a surprise to anyone. As you increase the arrow masses, in this case we're increasing them by 50 grain steps, you can see the decrease in velocity at launch for each of them. Overall, the change in velocity at launch going from the 350 grain arrow all the way up into the 650 grain arrow was roughly 70 feet per second. That's a considerable change in velocity that you definitely will see in the trajectory of your arrow. And while we're on the topic of trajectory, my current sight tape is set up for the 350 grain arrows. So in order to shoot the heavier arrow masses out to the target that was set at 70 yards, I just dialed my sight until I was hitting near to the center of the target to make sure I wasn't going to break any arrows. For the 650 grain arrow, I had to dial that sight tape all the way down into the 118 yard pin just to give you a little insight into how much worse the trajectory was with the heaviest arrow. I'd also like to point out this chart is color-coded by the velocity value itself, with the highest velocities being highlighted in green and then transitioning all the way down to the red velocities being the lowest velocities that were recorded. So looking here at the bottom row, where we have the loss at 60 yards, this is going to show us for each arrow what is the loss in velocity between launch and 60 yards. And just like we'd expect, the lightest arrow is going to lose the most velocity over that distance. So you can see here that the lightest arrow loses twice the velocity over those 60 yards when compared to the heaviest arrow. However, although the lighter arrows lose more velocity over that distance, they're still going faster at 60 yards than each of the heavier arrows. One of the last things I want to mention about this velocity chart is that these values all relate to an arrow that was shot at high elevation. When I collected the data, I was shooting at 6,111 feet. If I were to take my bow all the way down to sea level and repeat this experiment, I would expect these values to almost double, meaning that the 350 grain arrow would likely have 40 some feet per second in loss, and the heaviest arrow at 650 grains would probably experience somewhere around 20 feet per second in loss. Velocity is definitely one of those things that's going to define the trajectory of your arrow. I have some future videos that I'm going to come out that show more of the trajectory values based around these velocities that were recorded here. But for now, I want to focus on two of the measures that people commonly associate the downrange performance of an arrow, especially when it comes to hunting with, that being the momentum and the kinetic energy of the projectile. So here you can see all the kinetic energies for each arrow from launch all the way out to 60 yards. One of the first things you'll notice is the kinetic energy actually increases slightly as you increase the mass of the arrow. What's actually happening here is your bow is becoming slightly more efficient by pushing a heavier arrow. So although we see this slight increase in kinetic energy, it's really not that considerable. When you go from the 350 grain arrow up to the 650 grain arrow, you only gain roughly 6% in kinetic energy, but you almost had to double the mass of the arrow to do so. So the important thing to actually look at here is at whatever shot distance you would actually be taking, how much kinetic energy you would still have when it impacts your target. That's really what matters to us as bow hunters. It's not whatever value, momentum, or kinetic energy when the arrow is launched, but it's the kinetic energy or momentum when it hits the target. You can see in the bottom row, once again, this is the loss in kinetic energy that you would have from launch all the way out to 60 yards. So you can see, once again, the heavier arrow is retaining more of that kinetic energy from launch. This leads to you having roughly 10% more kinetic energy in the heavy arrow than you do with the light arrow all the way out at 60 yards. It's also interesting to note that the kinetic energy of the 650 grain arrow at 60 yards is actually slightly higher than the kinetic energy of the 350 grain arrow just at 20 yards. So although there is this discrepancy between the kinetic energy at these different yardages, I really don't think these values are all that different between each other. If you're one of the people who uses kinetic energy as an indicator for the penetration of an arrow, I really don't think that increasing the arrow mass all the way up to 650 grains seems that necessary to do so. Now that we've discussed the kinetic energy chart, let's move on to the momentum chart. This to me is where things get a little bit more interesting in favor of the heavy arrows. When you look at this chart, you can actually see the discrete step-ups in momentum as you increase arrow mass just by looking at the color coding of the chart itself. If you just focus on the 350 grain arrow and the 400 grain arrow right now, there's some interesting behavior. You can actually see that the momentum at 60 yards for the 400 grain arrow is slightly higher than the 350 grain arrow has at launch. This is one of the things that the Ashby guys have really honed in on in their argument in favor of heavy arrows. You can see that trend in behavior stay pretty similar as you go through and compare each arrow to the one lighter than it. If you take it to the extreme and look at the 650 grain arrow versus the 350 grain arrow, you can actually see that you gain 40% more momentum by increasing your arrow mass to 650 grains. The real downside for this is you had to nearly double your arrow mass to gain 40% more momentum. All right, so once again, I want to pull your attention to the loss at 60 row, all the way at the bottom of the chart. For the momentum, it's actually interesting behavior where it stays somewhat consistent in the change from launch all the way out to 60 yards for each of the arrows. Even though there is a consistent loss of momentum across all the different arrows, you can still see that step up in momentum for each of the arrows as you increase mass, with each of the heavier arrows having a comparable momentum value at 60 yards when compared to the arrow lighter than it. The real downside to this would be the loss in trajectory. The lighter arrows are going to have a much more forgiving trajectory and get to your target much faster than the heavier arrows. I'm going to make future videos on both of these, but for this video, I wanted to specifically focus on velocity, kinetic energy, and momentum first. So now that we looked at the results for all of these arrows, comment down below what you think are the more important factors in looking at for assessing the penetration of an arrow. I'm also really interested to hear what the common guy is actually shooting. Is it more in the mid 400 range? Or are people shooting 500 plus grain arrows? Or are people going full Ashby and shooting 650 grain arrows when they're hunting? And as I mentioned before, I'm going to have future videos using this data set to look at the trajectory and time of flight of these arrows all the way out to 60 yards. So if you want to see more of that study and make sure you don't miss it, feel free to subscribe below. Finally, if you made it this far in the video, I really want to thank you for watching, and I hope you got something out of it.